All right, what is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. I'm your host, JK, and we are kicking off episode number 206 of Help Me Understand. Before getting into today's fitness-focused episode, where we are going to answer the question, how often should I change my workouts? I first, as always, want to say thank you for choosing to press play on the Help Me Understand podcast. You certainly have no shortage of podcasts and other types of content that you can consume, especially within the fitness space. So I truly never take it for granted that you chose to press play on Help Me Understand. And as a reminder, if you didn't already know, Help Me Understand is sponsored by Feed Your Habits. Feed Your Habits, full transparency, is a company that I co-own with two other business partners, and we primarily design and distribute t-shirts and sweatshirts, both crew necks, hoodies, the whole 9 yards there, for folks that understand that habits don't just grow on their own, they need to get fed. So if you'd like to check out what we have to offer, hop on over to feedyourhabits.com. At checkout, you can put in my promo code, which is in all caps, JKFYH. So JKFYH for Feed Your Habits. That'll get you an additional 10% off along with free shipping inside of the United States. So make sure to check out the fine folks. Again, full transparency, me being one of those fine folks with my two other partners at feedyourhabits.com, the official sponsor of the Help Me Understand podcast. All right, let's go ahead and get into today's episode. So let's talk about some things that I want to share with you that I want you to take into consideration when figuring out how often to change your workouts. Now, from the perspective that I'm going to bring this perspective as I'm going to primarily have my coaching hat on for this particular episode. And I say primarily have my coaching hat on because also currently I'm programming my own workouts too. So there'll be a bit of personal bias, or maybe I'll share a little bit of my personal perspective on this as also a lifestyle person, somebody who likes to work out and design workouts for myself. However, as my grandfather used to say, the main thing that I want to do is approach this from the standpoint of being somebody who is a coach and a personal trainer who takes care of workouts for not only one-on-one clients, also for various groups too. So let's talk about how often to change your workouts. So the first thing that I'm going to let you know is when it comes to answering that particular question, to my I was going to say to my knowledge, my belief is that there is not a hard and fast rule for absolutely everybody. So this is like many questions that are asked in the fitness and nutrition space, most effectively answered with, it depends. And let's go ahead and follow that up with actually giving you some helpful information. So it depends on what. So first, I want you to understand that when it comes to figuring out how often to change your workouts, remember that the progression that you are noticing in your workouts is going to matter way more than constantly varying the type of exercises that you're doing. I should also mention that I am going to be answering this question through the lens of hypertrophy, or what's more commonly known as developing or building muscle. So if you are someone who is primarily looking for athletic performance, so you are looking to, you're talking about how often should I change up my exercises because I'm a soccer player, this is not going to be the best possible information that you could get, because I'm assuming that primarily the program you're going to be following is something that, especially if it's something that's developed by a strength and conditioning coach for you, that is geared towards your athletic performance, versus I am talking to the general population, lifestyle person, could be competitor also here too, who is just trying to figure out like, hey, how often should I be switching up my workouts when my priority is on building and or maintaining muscle? So first things first, your progression with the movements and the amount of weight that you lift and the reps that you can do at a heavier weight is going to matter much more than consistently or constantly changing up the exercises that you're doing. I mention this because I don't think this is as much of a thing now. Back in the day, and I say back in the day, when I first got started in lifting, I would say, which was around 2010, 2011, there was a big buzz about like muscle confusion and that you needed to switch exercises every week or maybe every few weeks because you needed to quote unquote like shock the muscles and do like muscle confusion. And that that was, I think at this point we can put that under the heading of more bro science. So there's not a specific like, hey, you've really got to shock the muscles. Now, if we look at peeling back the layers of that particular phrase of shock the muscles, there is some truth in the fact that if you continually do the same thing over and over again, and I'll talk about this in kind of the second column of things that we're going to talk about like why you would make changes, there is a point where you start to notice what's called the repeated bout effect, where something is no longer effective for you. And so then it potentially is time to change things up. So I think what potentially happened with the whole like muscle confusion or shock the muscles was rooted in some truth. And then somebody took it and ran with it. The first program that comes to mind for me is something like P90X for sure. So it is not, I'm of the belief that it is not required that you do a different workout every single week in order to shock your muscles. So something important to remember is that hypertrophy, muscle building, happens from what we call progressive overload, not doing a whole bunch of random exercises. So by inserting very purposeful progressions, so a progression could be something like week number 1, you are doing enough reps that leaves about 3 to 4 reps in the tank. Then weeks 2, 3, and 4, you're leaving 1 to 2 reps in the tank with a particular movement, and so on. So that's like a linear type of progression. And then you start to notice like, last week I did 10 reps of 50 pounds. Then this week I was able to do 12 reps at 50 pounds. Then the next week I was able to do like 10 reps at 60 pounds. So you're noticing that particular progression. That's what we call noticing progressive overload. So you are noticing those particular progressions starting to happen. So that is a function, or that is one of the things that's important in order to actually build and develop muscle. So shocking the muscle, like basically, I was going to make some sort of joke about like scaring people, but shocking the muscle is not the main factor or one of the main factors in building muscle. Progression and progressive overload, that getting that stimulus of progressive overload is. So that's one. A second thing to understand before kind of deciding your time frame is that by sticking with the same movements for a certain amount of time, so there's a benefit to doing that, you can improve your technique, you can increase your load, and you become much more adept and confident at being able to target the specific muscle that you're really working to grow and develop. In a previous episode, I talked about mind-muscle connection, what that is, what that's all about. Mind-muscle connection is something that you are more apt to actually have happen and implement when you're actually gaining confidence and mastery of the movement itself. So that's something that also can be really helpful. So again, if you do have repetition in your program, that's fantastic because it actually puts you in a position where you can get better at performing the movement itself. Then at that point, once you feel more comfortable about just your actual form in executing the movement, then you can actually feel confident in, okay, well, let me go ahead and bump up my weight. So there you go. And then lastly, just again, to reiterate, just in this particular portion, instead of changing exercises like all the time, really put the energy and the focus into working on different progressions, like again, increasing the amount of reps that you can do at a particular weight, and or increasing also the amount of weight that you can lift or squat or pull or whatever it may be. And then also with doing those two things, you also are then increasing the amount of intensity. that you are performing the movement in. And intensity doesn't always mean that you're doing it faster. In fact, intensity in the hypertrophy space, from my point of view, is more related to how difficult or how high a level of exertion you have for that movement. So let's say that if I'm going to do a bench press and I bench press 200 pounds for 10 reps, and I say on a scale of 1 to 10, during week number 1, doing 200 pounds for 10 reps felt like it was about a 9 out of 10. Like that was a 9 out of 10 as far as how hard it was. We call that RPE, rate of perceived exertion. So let's say over time, by repeating that particular movement and taking care of business outside of the gym, so my nutrition, my sleep, my recovery, all that good stuff, then I get to 4 weeks later and 200 pounds for 10 reps actually feels like, man, I feel like that's an exertion level of maybe 5 or 6. So at that point, I clearly have gotten stronger, and 200 pounds for 10 reps is no longer as difficult as it was before. So that's something where when you do stick to a structure for a decent amount of time, you're able to see that progression. If you're constantly changing things every single week, you don't put yourself in a position to do that. Okay, so now let's talk about when and why you would want to actually make changes to your program. So I jotted down a few things here to take into consideration. So I've got 3 things that you can consider. So one would be that you've plateaued in your results. So assuming that you are tracking your training, so you're tracking how many sets, how many reps, how much weight you use for particular movements, you hit a point where you are no longer able to make progressions. Then you also are tracking results, let's say outside of the gym. So it's not just about the sets, reps, and load. You're also staying consistent with what things look like nutrition wise, sleep, recovery, all the things that I normally talk about that support training. And you're just noticing that overall results are just stalled. And this one can be even one that can be a whole additional podcast topic, is really understanding what it means to be at a plateau. I think that far too often folks will feel like they are at a plateau because, let's say, their body weight has stayed the same for like 3 to 4 days or even a week. They just, it's maybe fluctuated maybe half a pound up or down over the last week, and they feel like that's a stall. And we're talking about, say, if somebody's looking at like fat loss. I would say if you generally are within like a maintenance period, then that's not as much of a thing. You then at that point are looking at your performance and looking at how things are going there. So if you, I would consider a plateau to be if I've got a client who is generally in like maintenance or maybe a little bit above maintenance, or we're in muscle gain. And what we're noticing is that they are just not able to make any sort of progressions. I would say over about a 3-week period. I would say somewhere in about 3 weeks, because I think 1 week is too quick to make a judgment on that. 2, give or take, because I would look at things that are going on outside of the gym prior to saying like, yeah, we need to switch up these workouts because things have been the same for 2 weeks. Typically, we also are accounting for things that are happening outside of the gym. So if we're talking about sleep might be a little bit off, if stress levels are a bit higher, whether it's based on something going on at home or something going on at work. And so then that typically ends up being linked to a change in what sort of nutrition choices are happening and things like that. Even that, like that can keep things somewhat quote unquote plateaued for 2 weeks. So really I prefer to go around 3 weeks, like the 2 to 3 week time frame before going like, oh, okay, I see. Like, yeah, we do need to go ahead and make a shift here somehow. So that's one thing that comes into play when deciding when and why to make changes. If you've plateaued. And again, this is where it's helpful to work with a coach, because you can have another eye on the data from somebody who understands what your history is, the path that you're on, knows the right questions to ask, things like that. A second component to understanding when and why to make changes to your program is going to be if you are noticing that particular exercises are causing pain and or discomfort. You're just noticing that things just seem like little nagging things just seem to lag on or carry on for a couple of weeks. Like again, that's something where okay, maybe we need to make a shift here. And then the last point that I've got under this particular one is that if just straight up you're just starting to feel like kind of burned out from doing the same thing over and over again. And this is where I'll briefly mention there's something that's called the repeated bout effect. So the repeated bout effect, in just very general layman's terms, is where your body essentially adapts both mentally and physically to doing the same movements over and over and over again. So when I say adapts mentally and physically, first from a physical standpoint, that we can go back and relate to what I talked about with plateauing as far as strength. So you're no longer really noticing that you can lift any heavier. You're not noticing that you can get like squeeze out a few more reps or anything along those lines. That's where your body is just like, yeah, we've kind of done what we can do. And then also from a neurological standpoint or from a mental standpoint, like you're just tapped out, like you are just bored to life with doing the same, like the goblet squat, the same goblet squat for three sets times 10 to 12 reps, like bored with doing the same single arm dumbbell row, 3 sets times 10 to 12 reps for forever. Like there does come a point where you are just completely burned out from doing those particular things. And that is a portion, you can go a lot deeper into this, but that's a portion of the repeated bout effect. Now, a couple of things that can come up with the repeated bout effect on the negative side, because let me do a quick aside here. A positive thing about the repeated bout effect, I guess if we had to pull out a positive, is that um, instead of, let's say, experiencing like soreness and things like that, your body has now adapted to the movement itself. Because I will have clients within the first, let's say like the first week to 2 weeks, normally the first week, and then sometimes it'll carry into the second week, but usually after the second week, we're all good. Report back like, ooh, things are just, I'm not saying I'm sore, but my coach used to ask me this, like, so you're not saying you're sore, but you can tell you worked out. I'm like, yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Like you just notice that you are using muscle groups in a bit of a different way than you previously have, and it's just this those folks, if you're listening, like if you know what I'm talking about. So it could be a little bit of soreness, and soreness is definitely not a bad thing. Like just because you're sore doesn't mean that all of a sudden you did something wrong, but there's a difference between like soreness and actual like pain and injury. And extreme discomfort. So that's a little bit different. With the repeated bout effect, when properly managed, there is going to come a point where that soreness really subsides, and that's when you can really get an understanding of, okay, now I can really kind of push things because we've gotten through that initial novelty where it's something that was a newer stimulus for me. Maybe we changed the way that I was gripping something on a row. So instead of it being a more lat focused row, now it's more of like a rear delt focused row. Instead of doing my squats like traditional barbell back squat, maybe we switch to like a hack squat or a leg press. So that stimulus is just different. Those are things that after you've done them for a while, then you start to kind of get in the groove. So I don't want to mistake the repeated bout effect, like the negative aspects of a repeated bout effect, with the good stimulus of, okay, now I'm into a groove, I've gotten more comfortable. So there's a difference with like comfort versus, okay, now one of my clients framed it as like the law of diminishing returns when we were having a conversation just today about this. So I shout out to her for that, because that was a good way to put it too. Like you just hit the law of diminishing returns where you can continue to do the same thing over and over, but it's no longer really effective. You're kind of burned out. You're wiped out for it. So, all right. So now we get to the direct answer for just a general rule of thumb of how often should I switch up my training program. And I would generally say somewhere in the 5 to 12 week range is where I tend to operate with pretty much, I'm trying to think, pretty much every program that I write. And right now, I write for my one on one clients, and then I have two different group programs. And all of those programs are somewhere in, actually, one of them we do cycle of 4 weeks every now and then. So a 4 to 12 weeks. But generally, I like to say 5 to 12 weeks is the range that you would look at. So let's talk about how you decide within that 5 to 12 week range. Like, okay, well, that's a pretty big range. I mean, you're talking like, okay, basically a little over a month versus 3 months. So every 1 to 3 months. So here are some things, and I didn't jot this part down, but here are some things that I take into consideration. One is going to be what type of program we're doing. Are we primarily doing something that is like a upper lower, like a body part split, like an upper body, lower body, 4 days a week? Or are we doing something that's more like total body 3 days a week? That with those particular ones, I do typically like to stretch those a bit longer, if at all possible. And I would say longer being like at minimum. I typically, for my one-on-one clients, like to have those around 8 weeks or more, if at all possible. The reason for that is because with those where we're training, we're really kind of digging deep into specific like muscle development and hypertrophy. What it does is, because we are very focused on that muscle development and that muscle growth, and also taking into account, this is the key. It's not just about the program, it's also taking into account the lifestyle factors of the majority of the people that I work with, and likely the majority of the people that are listening to this podcast. It allows us to take us through all of the different ebbs and flows that are going to happen in someone's life. Those can be things like upswings or downswings in stress levels, upswings or downswings in levels of responsibility at work, at home, combination at school, the combination of all those different things. It takes into account time that we need to take off for sickness and or injury if that happens to occur. It also takes into account vacations and travel, and maybe some weeks it's typically you're training 4 days a week, but then other weeks, there's a couple other weeks where maybe we needed to go to 2 to get through a time frame where things were kind of crazy. So if I'm constantly operating with, I'm going to switch things every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, then it can be very difficult to really get into a groove. The constant changing, this is an analogy that I used to use when I would talk to folks about the difference with doing hypertrophy training versus CrossFit, because that was one of the main things that I could kind of think about as somebody who, for a while, CrossFit was probably about like 60 to 70% of how I trained. And then the other percentage was more bodybuilding. Now it's definitely flipped to more like 98% being bodybuilding. And I don't really do CrossFit anymore. But one of the analogies that I would give is, you can do a lot of random stuff, but doing a lot of random things and changing your exercises every week to 2 weeks is very similar to when you need to vacuum a room and you use a Roomba. So if we take a living room and we need to vacuum that, if we're going to take the random approach, we would just set the Roomba up and it would kind of, it'd go all over the place, assuming everybody who's listening to this is familiar with a Roomba, what it does, all that good stuff. So it's going to go to the left, it'll go to the right, it'll go backwards, might stop for a while, then it'll go forward, backwards. So it'll go kind of all over the place. It will eventually take care of your entire living room. So that is what the approach is like when you are working to build muscle, by doing a whole bunch of different things and changing your split and changing your exercises every week. That's like using a Roomba. Now, with a very specific, targeted, structured approach, that would be more like we're going to use a regular, like a Dyson vacuum or a Shark vacuum, and we're going to start at one end of the room. We're going to go down, then we're going to, hit the edging tool, then turn around and come back up the other way. Like that, those beautifully vacuumed living rooms. You guys know what I'm talking about, or maybe even a lawnmower would have been a better example for all the lawn junkies that are out there. But you get my point. Doing a very structured program, you get a whole lot more bang for your buck in a very organized manner. You get into a groove and you just ride out the wave that way versus the Roomba that's all over the place. So by sticking with exercises for, at minimum, absolute minimum, 4 weeks, but preferably again somewhere in like the 5 to 12 week range, you put yourself in a position to get into a groove, get into a rhythm, and then begin to stack the progressions week over week, or session over session, or every other week you're noticing like some gains and different things like that. So that's the range that I typically like people to operate in. Now, for my folks that really crave a lot of variety, if you're familiar with neurotyping, then you know what I'm talking about, like you're a 1B or a 2A. I won't get into that. I think I've done like previous episodes with that. Or if you tap into the Mind Over Macros podcast with Mike Milner and you go back to some of his earlier episodes from a few years ago, you can learn everything you need to know about neurotyping, or go to neurotypetraining.com. Just remember, go to neurotypetraining.com. There's a lot that's there. There are certain personality types that really, really crave variety. So what we do, and I've built neurotype training programs for coming up on 7 years now, and still use a lot of those principles behind the scenes. I don't mention it as much. However, it is basically behind the scenes in my one-on-one programs. What we do is, if somebody likes a lot of variety, then what I will do is at minimum, like try and get them on a 5-week program. So if I can get them on a 5-week program, we're usually doing pretty good. And we're talking somebody who typically was switching programs every like 2 weeks at best, or maybe 3. So what we would do is we get on a 5-week program, and what we do is keep the movements pretty much so let's say if we're doing 5 to 6 movements, we keep about 3 movements exactly the same for about 3 weeks, and then switch some of the accessory pieces about halfway through there. So if we can stretch them to 6 weeks, cool. So basically what we do is we feed that need for variety through the accessory work, and then we keep the staple movements, things like some sort of deadlift variations, some sort of lower body push, so some sort of squat or leg press, you keep that the same, some sort of row, like basically all of your big compound power movements, those we keep the same. So if you're somebody who craves a lot of variety and you're trying to figure out, okay, I just got this need for novelty and switching things up, still recommend that you are repeating those movements. If you can give me 5 to 6 weeks, like, we're golden. So repeat those movements for about a 5 to 6 week time frame. I recommend do the compound movements, keep those same compound movements throughout, but you can have a little bit more variety with your accessory movements, because at the end of the day, it's going to be really important that you're doing something that's engaging and also matches the results that you're trying to get to. So if you're telling me like, hey, I want really developed delts, but you're constantly like switching up different things that you're doing, you're not giving those delts enough repetition and intensity to actually develop. Again, you're going with the Roomba strategy. So you're just doing a different shoulder exercise every Tuesday on shoulder day, versus, okay, for the next 6 weeks, like, let's really stick with this specific, like front delt press or whatever the case may be. Then we see a whole lot better results. Now, on the flip side, if you are somebody who loves to be like the steady Eddie, I'm going to keep things exactly the same, then we can operate more in like the 8 to 12 week range. So folks that can stick with a program in that 8 to 12 week range, those I really, really dig. It takes, I'm going to say, I know just based on the psychographic that usually I work with, I don't have a whole lot of people who are down with that. I have a very small handful. However, with those folks, they are extremely consistent. They are typically very rhythmic in nature. And when I say rhythmic in nature, they thrive on routine and rhythm, and they are good to go. They handle, um, they actually do really well with handling like a lot of weird stuff that happens. They don't love it when things throw them off their routine. However, it takes less time for them to get back to their routine because they know what their routine is. And I can think of a couple of folks that I work with right off the bat who are in like the 12-week blocks, and they're just steady Eddie. Like they're great at that. But again, a main piece of that, there's really two things. One, if they ever are knocked out of their rhythm, it's easier to partner with them to get them back on their rhythm just because it's not a confusion about, okay, what am I trying to get back to? They've been doing the same thing for forever, so they know what to get back to. Like they know the systems that they have in place. And then number two, what I watch out for with folks like that, like if you're somebody who's listening and you think to yourself, like, no, I don't mind doing the same thing for 3 months in a row. Like that's not a big deal to me at all. Something that I do then keep an eye on is looking at, okay, are we still making progress in the movements though? Because sometimes they can get so comfortable and so into a groove that they're no longer really pushing themselves. So that's again where that repeated bout effect, or the law of diminishing returns, like they're just kind of doing the same thing over and over again, and it is no longer presenting enough of a challenge from a stimulus standpoint in order for them to actually make progress. So just because somebody is really, really good at developing a rhythm and sticking to it doesn't mean that that's always a great thing. So if you're a coach out there who's listening to this, or if you are somebody who's self-coached, definitely take the time to go back and look and make sure, like, yeah, you can wave the I'm consistent flag all day. Make sure that that consistency is actually still providing you enough of a challenge to move towards the results that you're expecting to see. It falls kind of under that headline of like, no news is good news. I've definitely learned that is not always the case. So definitely make sure to check in on that. Now, I will say with the extreme, I'm going to wrap this up pretty shortly. I'll talk about a couple of things you can do to kind of switch things up without changing your complete program. You don't have to completely overhaul it. Um, what was I gonna say? I tried to just tease what the last part was gonna be and then lost it. All right, well, if it comes back to me, then cool. So why don't I just jump right into a couple of things that you can do if you want to freshen things up but not quite change the entire program. So a couple of things that you can do is one, what I talked about with where you keep your compound movements the same throughout the entire program, and you just change your accessory work, say every 2 to 3 weeks. So accessory work would be your smaller muscle groups, biceps, triceps, things like delts, abductors, abs. So if you're doing core work, you can switch that up a bit. Delts, I usually like, let me rewind on that one. I usually like delts. I like people to kind of keep that the same for a while. However, again, if you're keeping like a consistent shoulder press, then you're probably pretty much good to go on those, but you can change your accessory movements. I talked about that one earlier. Another one is just changing the tempo of a particular movement. So one of the things that I tested for myself recently before putting it into client programs was what I'm calling just aggressive eccentrics. So it's something where we use like a 10-second eccentric count on like a goblet squat. So for example, the eccentric refers to the lowering portion of the movement. So say if for a goblet squat, that means like in one of the programs I wrote in a 10-second eccentric. So that's 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, like all the way to 10 from top to the bottom of the movement. Now I do keep it in a bit of a lower rep count because nobody needs to be squatting for like 5 minutes per set. However, that's a way where inserting little things like that here and there where you change the tempo of the movement can be a nice way to switch things up without completely overhauling the program. And then also just changing how like the grip of a particular movement. So Something like with bicep curls, if you've constantly done bicep curls with your palms up, like a supinated position or supinated position, with palms facing the sky, then switching over to a hammer curl can be something helpful. And then that's just an example. So changing up your grip. And then last, but certainly not least, changing up the type of machine or equipment that you're using for the movement itself. So even with your compound stuff, maybe for a 8 to 12 week period, you did nothing but back squat. Well, for the next 8 to 12 weeks, unless you specifically need to work the back squat, switch over to something like a leg press or a hack squat. If you have constantly used the Smith machine, let's say for hip thrusts, try and go to, if you have something like a glute drive machine that you can get access to, switch over to something like that. So you're still working the general muscle groups that are the same over that 8 to 12 week period, but you switch it up a little bit where you get some variety, but you do it in a purposeful and intentional way. All right. And to finish things out here, I do remember what I wanted to say. Uh, I guess the flip side of this would be, okay, well, how long is too long to keep the same movements in a program? And to that, I would say I do start to question things after about 12 weeks. And that's not a magical number. So it's not like if all of a sudden, okay, well, it's been 12 weeks and 3 days, or, it's almost like treating it like intermittent fasting. Like if you eat after 8 p.m., calories like go daily double. I'm not, miss me with that. I'm not saying that. But generally, I would say if it's been 12 weeks and we haven't switched things up, and usually I'm pre-planning this stuff with a client in advance, so we don't get to like 12 weeks and like, hey, do you think we should change it? Those are the majority of my clients. Like everybody is wildly different. Actually, I've got some that are at 5 weeks and all the way up to 12. So 5 to 12 for my private clients. But I would really then be taking a look at signs of, okay, I'm just noticing we've pretty much at this point been at the same weights, same sets, same reps, everything for a couple of weeks now, and we're hitting week number 12 anyway. So let's switch things up. And that switch up can look something like changing from, again, I mentioned like changing equipment, changing grip, different things like that. Or I've got one of my clients who is on an overall 12-week training block. But what we do is we are currently doing like full body for 8 weeks. We're doing full body for 8 weeks. And then for 4 weeks, we take the same exact movements, but we switch it into an upper lower split. So instead of doing, full body 3 days a week, then for the last 4 weeks, we switch it to an upper body, lower body split, same exact movements, but we're changing the way in which we're doing those, the way that they're laid out. This particular individual is somebody who just really likes the rhythm and all that good stuff. However, I like to make sure that they're still being challenged. So something I was talking about earlier. Okay. So I believe that covers everything that I wanted to go over. So again, when it comes down to getting an understanding of, okay, when is the right time for me to change my workouts, or how often should I be changing my workouts? It depends. And also, hopefully you feel like with the information that I've just given you, you actually have some better things to think about, and most importantly, put into play and put into action when you're deciding for yourself what the answer to that question is. All right. So if you have listened this long, I certainly appreciate you. Thank you so much for listening. If you could do me one last favor and leave either a rating and or a review or a comment, just depending on the platform that you are listening or watching on. This one should be on YouTube. If you're watching, leave a comment. Just let me know what you thought about today's episode. Even better yet, forward it to a friend who you think might find it helpful. If you want to reach out, connect with me to get an understanding of what I may have available to help you out from a coaching standpoint, or just want me to take a look at your program and see, hey, how do you feel like this works for the goals that I have? That is a newer free service that I am offering. You just got to connect with me. My information will be in the show notes. So with that, thank you for listening to the Help Me Understand podcast. Take care. I'll talk to you next time.